interesting possibility, but the immediate miracle had been arranged. A coach to take Prabhupada out of the crowded throngs of Kumbh Mela to Calcutta. Amazing, just see. Prabhupada had such an influence on this Mr. Gupta that he arranged for another car to be added, first class, which means he would be in the first class carriage on his own with his disciples. After a difficult car ride, inching along through the crowds from the Triveni to the train station, Prabhupada and his party finally arrived at the railway station, where government men helped him and his disciples with their luggage and sought their comfort. From the devotee's point of view, this was the proper respect for a pure devotee of the Lord, the most important person in the world, yet such treatment was rare. Srila Prabhupada was pleased, and he asked his secretary to type a letter thanking Mr. Gupta, who was caring for Prabhupada just like a father looking after a son. He invited Mr. Gupta and his family to attend the upcoming Gaur Purnim festival in Mayapur. Shri Chaitanya ki, Shri Prabhupada ki. Jai Jai Shri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda. Jai Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhaktavinda. Jai Jai Shri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda. Jai Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhaktavinda. Jai Jai Shri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda. Jai Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhaktavinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare. Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Reading from Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Mahajalila, Chapter 17, the Lord travels to Vrindavan, beginning from text 157. Premanandi Nachigaya Sagana Hunkara Prabhura Prima Vesha Deki Loka Chamatkara. When Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu chanted, danced and made loud vibrations, all the people were astonished to see his ecstatic form, his ecstatic love. Eka viprapade prabhura charana dariya prabhu sange nrityakari prema vishtahana. One Brahmin fell at the lotus feet of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and then began to dance with him in ecstatic love. Dune preme nrityakari kare kola kuli Hare Krishna ka dune bale bahutuli. The two of them danced in ecstatic love and embraced each other. Raising their arms, they said, "Chant the holy names of Hari and Krishna." Loka Hari Hari Bali Kola Hala Haila Keshava Sevaka Prabhu Kemala Praraila. All the people then began to chant Hari Hari, and there was a great uproar. The priest in Lord Keshava's service offered Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu a garland. Lokikahi Prabhu Deki Hana Vishmaya Aiche Hena Prema Laukika Kabunaya. When the people saw Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's dancing and chanting, they were struck with wonder, and they all said, "Such transcendental love is never an ordinary thing." Yanhara Darshani Loke Preme Matahana Hase Kande Nachi Gaya Krishna Namalana. The people said, simply by seeing Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, everyone is maddened with the love of Krishna. Indeed, everyone is laughing, crying, dancing, chanting, and taking the holy names of Krishna. Sarvata Nishchitta Inho Krishna Avatara Mathura Aila Lokera Karite Nishtara. Certainly Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is in all respects the incarnation of Lord Krishna. Now he has come to Mathura to deliver everyone. Tabi Mahaprabhu se Brahmane Lana Tanhare Puchila Kichu Nibrite Vishaya. After this, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu took the Brahmin aside, sitting in a solitary place. The Lord began to question him. Hariya Sarala Tumi Vriddha Brahmana Kahan Haite Paile Tumi E Premadana. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, "You are an elderly Brahmin, you are sincere, and you are advanced in spiritual life. Wherefrom have you gotten this transcendental opulence of ecstatic love for Krishna?" The Brahmin replied, "His Holiness Sri Madhavendra Puri came to the city of Mathura while he was on tour. Kripa kari teno mora, nila ye aila, more shishya kari mora, hate bhiksha kaila." While at Mathura, Sri Pad Madhavendra Puri visited my house and accepted me as a disciple. He even took lunch at my home. Kupala prakatakari seva kaila mahashaya, adya piha tanhara seva govardhani haya. After installing the deity of Gopal, Srila Madhavendra Puri rendered him service. That very deity is still being worshipped at Govardhan Hill. Text 169. Shuni Prabhu Kaila Tanra Charana Vandana Bayam Pana Prabhu Paya Padila Brahmana. As soon as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu heard about Madhavendra Puri's relationship with the Brahmin, he immediately offered obeisances at his feet. Becoming fearful, the Brahmin also immediately fell at the Lord's feet. Prabhu Kai Tumi Guru Amishisha Praya Guru Hana Shishi Namaskara Nayuyaya. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, "You are on the platform of my spiritual master, and I am your disciple. Since you are my spiritual master, it is not befitting that you offer me obeisances." Shuniya Vishmita Vipra Kahi Baya Pana Aiche Badkaha Kene Sanyasi Hana. Upon hearing this, the Brahmin became afraid, and he then said, "Why do you speak like this? You are a sannyasi." Kintu tomara prema deki mane anumani Madhavendra Purira Sambandana Dara Jani. Upon seeing your ecstatic love, I can just imagine that you must have some relationship with Madhavendra Puri. This is my understanding. Krishna prema tanha yanha tanhara sambandha tahan vina e premara kahan nahi ganda. This kind of ecstatic love can be experienced only when one has a relationship with Madhavendra Puri. Without him, even a scent of such transcendental ecstatic love is impossible. Tabi Bhattacharya Tari Sambandha Kahila Shuniyan Nandita Vipra Nachite Lagila. Balabhadra Bhattacharya then explained the relationship between Madhavendra Puri and Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. After hearing this, the Brahmin became very pleased and began to dance. Tabi Vipra Prabhurilana Aila Nijagari Apana Ichaya Prabhura Nana Seva Kare. The Brahmin then took Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to his home and out of his own free will began to serve the Lord in various ways. Bhikshalagi Bhattacharya Karaila Randana Tabi Mahaprabhu Hasi Balila Vachana. He asked Balabhadra Bhattacharya to cook Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's lunch. At that time the Lord, smiling, spoke as follows: Puri Gosani Tomara Gari Karya Chena Bhiksha Muri Tumi Bhiksha Deha E Mora Shiksha. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, "Madhavendra Puri has already taken lunch at your place. Therefore you may cook and give me the food. That is my instruction." Yajadatar Titeshras Tatade Vitaro Janaha Sayat Pramanam Kurute Lokastadanavartate. Whatever action a great man performs, common men follow. Whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. This is quotation from Bhagavad Gita 3.21. Yajyapi Sanodiya Haya Saita Brahmana Sanodiya Gari Sanyasi Nakari Bhojana. The Brahmin belonged to the Sonadiya Brahmin community, and a sannyasi does not accept food from such a Brahmin. Could you pass me a handkerchief, please? Tissue. Is there none there? Huh? Is it used?
No, it's clean.
Thank you. Srila Prabhupada's purport. In northwestern India, Vaishyas are divided into various subdivisions. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur points out that they are divided as Agarwal, Kalawar and Sanwada. Out of them, the Agarwals are said to be first-class Vaishyas, and the Kalawars and the Sanwadas are considered lower due to their occupational degradation. The Kalawars generally take wine and other intoxicants. Although they are Vaishyas, they are considered to belong to a lower class. The priests who give the Kalawars and the Sanwadas, who guide them, are called Sanodiya Brahmins. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur states that the word Sanoyada in Bengal indicates Swarnavanik. In Bengal, there are priests who guide the Suvarnavanik community, which is also considered a low class. There is little difference between the Sanwadas and the Suvarnavaniks. Generally, the Suvarnavaniks are bankers dealing in gold and silver. In Western India, the Agarwals also belong to the banking profession. This is the original business of the Suvarnavanik or Agarwal community. Historically, the Agarwals come from the upcountry named Ayodhya, and the Suvarnavanik community also came from Ayodhya. It therefore appears that the Suvarnavaniks and the Agarwals belong to the same community. Sanodiya Brahmins were the guides of the Kalawaras and Sanwadas. They are therefore considered to be lower-class Brahmins, and a sannyasi is not allowed to take alms or food from them. However, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu accepted lunch cooked by a Sanodiya Brahmin simply because he belonged to Madhavendra Puri's community. Srila Madhavendra Puri was the spiritual master of Ishwara Puri, who was the spiritual master of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Thus, a spiritual relationship was established on the spiritual platform without consideration of material inferiority or superiority. Om Agyanitamarandasya Gyananjana Salakaya Chakshurmlitam Yena Tasman Shirvi Namaha Mikam Karoti Vachalam Pangam Lagate Girim Yatkripatamam Vande Shigrim Dintaranam Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shiva Sati Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. The verse again. The Brahmin belonged to the Sanodiya Brahmin community, and the sannyasi does not accept food from such a Brahmin. So here Lord Chaitanya is showing that even though this Brahmin belonged to a caste of Brahmin, which generally a sannyasi wouldn't accept from because they were considered to be a low-class Brahmin on account of their association with guiding low-class Vaishyas. Now, it's not that Lord Chaitanya is discriminating in the sense that there's some kind of class war going on here, but he's because Lord Chaitanya is Patita Pavana, he's the saviour of the most fallen, and he used to go and engage what the other Brahmins would consider untouchables or outcasts. He would embrace them and request them to chant Hare Krishna. So he was not discriminating in some way where he was subjugating or he was on some kind of high class, low class trip. It's not that he was proud and exhibiting distaste for lower classes, but he was showing that he was following a certain social custom on account of the behaviour of certain persons. So, for example, one may be magnanimous and they may help others, but you don't necessarily go. So, say for example, a devotee doesn't judge upon anybody whether they're fit for or not fit for devotional service. But at the same time, a devotee wouldn't sit in a pub with the hope that perhaps they can convince some drunken people to take to Krishna consciousness. They would associate with people in the same way of thinking. They would show mercy to people who are fallen, but at the same time they keep their association in such a way that they don't become influenced, because their responsibility is to create a good influence. In order to do that, then they have to protect themselves from a bad influence themselves. Prabhupada said that even if one is born in a good family, if we get the wrong association, then we can turn bad. And that happens. Sometimes people are born into a situation where they don't want for anything. They don't need anything materially. They've got good education, good looks, everything there. And then they get into the wrong association, and then their life becomes degraded, and they find themselves in so much trouble. And they cause so much anxiety for their parents who worry about them so much. So this is a situation that a devotee, although not discriminating or judging someone for their condition which they're in, then they're careful to avoid being influenced by their association. And a devotee thinks, there go I, but by the grace of God. Because in the West we're all fallen, we're less than Sudra, what to speak of Brahmins and Vaishyas. In Kali Yuga it's said that everybody is less than Sudra. Less than Sudra because even the Sudra is obedient to the higher classes, but if there's no higher classes, who can we be obedient to? So everyone is in Kali Yuga simply following the senses. So this Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, it's not so existent in Kali Yuga. Simply, people are not interested in moksha because they don't believe in an afterlife, and dharma, they're not really considering about duties. And even artha, economic development, they don't really want that, they just want kama, sense gratification. So this is the degraded age of Kali Yuga, where the guidelines of the Vedic literatures, the Guru, the Sadhus, so this is Guru, Sadhu and Shastra, these guidelines are not being, people are not even aware that they exist. And if we do, then we struggle to try to adhere to them because we are so conditioned by Kali Yuga. But Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Jeev Jago Gora Chanda Boli, Kota Nidar Jayo Maya Pisa Chirikoli, he's descended to the material world in the age of Kali to give us hope, to give us a way out of the material world, despite our unfortunate position where we are covered mainly by the modes of passion and ignorance. And as Kali Yuga progresses, if you can call it progress, more like as it goes on, it becomes more degraded, then it's very difficult to even understand simple structures from the Shastras. So Lord Chaitanya, he basically says, just chant Hare Krishna. This is what we have to do. So everything else we do is simply to support the advancement of the chanting of Hare Krishna for ourselves and to support the spreading of the chanting of the Mahamantra. So we may be materially qualified or unqualified. We may have certain good qualities or not good qualities, but ultimately in Kali Yuga, everyone is under the influence of the lower modes of material nature, namely passion and ignorance. Prabhupada noted that when he arrived in the West, Boston Harbour, he wrote this song, Markini Bhagavat Dharma, and he described how he could see that these places were governed by the modes of passion and ignorance. They had no knowledge of what the mode of goodness is, what to speak of transcending that. And he was wondering, how will I get them to hear your message? How will I get them to chant your name? And because he had full faith, then he simply just took the holy name and people took to it. He took the holy name to a public setting and people would take to it. They took to the chanting, and he would hold public discourses in Bhagavad Gita, and we're so fortunate that people started recording these right from the start, and we can hear these and we can see how Prabhupada started. It's all recorded there. So in many, many years to come, there'll be no mythology about who was this Prabhupada. Historically there are many great spiritual leaders, and then people think, well, perhaps it was just a group of people who got together and wrote some moral code. There's many speculations, and perhaps this person didn't exist, and people try to find some proof of the existence, etc. But here we see Srila Prabhupada's existence is recorded. He's not going to be a myth. His writings are there. He personally wrote, he didn't just speak, he personally wrote books. His photographs are there, his films are there, recordings are there. So this has all been cleverly preserved by the devotees, knowing the importance of Srila Prabhupada. And in this way, we got the association of someone. It's like when Prabhupada came to the West, although he was staying with the Agarwal family, incidentally, we're talking about the Agarwal community here, he stayed with the Agarwal family in Butler, Pennsylvania. Now, they weren't following the 4 regulative principles, probably not any of the regulative principles as far as I remember, but Prabhupada, he didn't take their association, and neither did he take offence upon them because he was their guest. So right from the beginning he was showing us how to be a guest in someone's house. Don't disturb your host. He could have said, what's this meat doing in the fridge? Why you've got alcohol in the house? Don't you know I'm a sadhu? You can't have these things here. What kind of Hindu are you? So he could have said like that, and he wouldn't have been wrong, but he didn't. And Sally Agarwal remembered that. In Prabhupada memory, she says that Prabhupada was so tolerant, even though he was such a great personality. Sometimes they would apologise for some of the things that they did, and he'd say, oh, think nothing of it. So Prabhupada says that if we cannot tolerate, then we're no better than the person we cannot tolerate. This was exemplified by him on one aeroplane flight. Hari Shori Prabhu told us that he'd arranged for Prabhupada to be in a non-smoking area in the plane. Of course, we can hardly imagine that nowadays, that back in the day they actually had smoking seats in the plane. It's a confined area, so it's not as if you can open the window and let a bit of fresh air in. So whether you're sitting in a smoking seat or non-smoking, it was just a matter of perhaps the intensity of how much smoke you got. Of course, nowadays they don't allow it. But then Harishwar Prabhu had arranged that Prabhupada could sit in an area which was non-smoking so he wouldn't be disturbed. But a couple of guys who sat in the non-smoking area just started smoking. And Harishwar Prabhu wanted to tell them off and get them to stop. And Prabhupada says, why are you bothered? He says, I'm not bothered. If you cannot tolerate, then you're no better than them. So, because he's seen that Harishwar Prabhu was annoyed, and he was annoyed because he didn't want his spiritual master to be inconvenienced, and he felt that this was disrespectful that these people would do this. So his motivation was good, but Prabhupada took the opportunity to teach him a further lesson, that I'm not disturbed, so why are you disturbed? And Prabhupada could have chose to say yes, and he wouldn't have been wrong either. But this is the life of the Acharya. And we see Lord Chaitanya also, he's showing us as the Supreme Personality of Godhead and as Chana Avatar, the incarnation of a devotee, or incarnating, playing the role of a devotee. And he was showing an example of how we should behave in different circumstances. So he'd behave in one way, and then when he discovered that there was a connection between this Brahmin, whom he normally wouldn't associate with, or wouldn't take meals in his house for, when he discovered there was a connection between him and Madhavendra Puri, who was his Paramaguru. Of course, Lord Chaitanya is Vishvambar, the maintainer of the universe. He doesn't require a guru. But even as Krishna, he accepted a guru, Sandipani Muni, to show us that we should also follow this way, that we shouldn't think that we don't need a spiritual master. And of course, need a spiritual master doesn't mean to say that we just get a funny name and we get a Brahmin thread, or we get some neck beads, and then we just consider ourselves part of the club. Needing the spiritual master means we need to be guided by him to get out of this material world. The spiritual master is guiding us through the pitfalls, how to avoid and how to get out of the entanglement of the material world. This is his great mercy. So the many, many examples Lord Chaitanya would show different instances how a devotee should behave. And this way he was setting the standard for even our devotees in ISKCON, how to behave, that even they can associate, but they shouldn't take association, they should give. And in this instance, he was showing that in Kirtan, they were chanting and dancing in ecstasy, but when he was invited for a meal, initially he was saying, no, I can't accept your invitation. So just like, because the devotees of ISKCON, their diet does not include meat, fish, eggs, garlic, onions, mushrooms, like that. So if someone was to invite us to a house, we wouldn't accept an invitation if any of these things were present. And we also don't accept invitations to eat in people's houses if they're engaged in activities such as eating meat themselves or regular intoxication, things like that, because the consciousness of the food goes in, the cook goes into the food, and Lord Chaitanya was demonstrating that. And Prabhupada explains this, just like if someone has tuberculosis and they're cooking, you eat that food, you will also get tuberculosis or some other highly contagious disease. So similarly, when someone is preparing food, then the consciousness is going into the food, the person is making it. Sometimes we see things advertised, made with love, and you think, well, in a factory with a machine, made with love. And I remember the meat industry had this thing, they were talking about made with love as well. It's like, it wasn't very loving to the animal to kill the animal. So they know that made with love is an attractive thing, and this is why home cooking is also considered something attractive. So the devotees are careful that they don't accept things which is going to contaminate their consciousness, not in some kind of holier than thou, but because their responsibility is to try to give Krishna consciousness to others, then they have to keep their consciousness above the lower modes of material nature. So just like someone may be a strong swimmer and there may be a shipwreck and someone tries to save some people, but if one gets a little bit too tired because they're having to save someone who is struggling too much and who doesn't want to be saved, then that can be a problem. So we have to maintain ourselves. Or if a doctor goes to some situation where there's a pandemic, then he can only be so much help if he's protecting himself from the effects of a pandemic. So this is similarly in Kali Yuga, it's a pandemic of the modes of passion and ignorance. And passion leads to ignorance, so it's going to be more and more ignorance as time goes on. And this ignorance is the cause of all suffering. We're ignorant to our own welfare, and we're ignorant to the suffering that we cause other people. So this Krishna consciousness movement purifies our consciousness so that we start to realize what we really are, what is our true benefit, and when we realize that other people are suffering as well, and that they can find some refuge from their suffering by taking to this Krishna consciousness. And that's why Prabhupada says that we cannot repay the debt to the spiritual master, but we can try to simply by sharing whatever we've learned in Krishna consciousness with other people. And by doing that, then the spiritual master is very pleased. So this is the main function of the Hare Krishna movement. It's a movement, which means it's not a Hare Krishna stagnant. It's not the Hare Krishna club. But a Hare Krishna movement, which means there is some movement going on. If we do not have some movement going on, then we're not churning the nectar. This churning the nectar refers to in the 8th canto when the demons and the demigods, the devatas and the asuras, were churning the ocean of milk to produce nectar. So when we're chanting, when we're engaging in devotional service, we're churning the nectar. And just as in the churning of the ocean of nectar, some poisonous things came out, and Lord Shiva very mercifully took that poison. So when we're chanting, when we're hearing, where we engage in service, sometimes impurities come up because they have to come out. And then we have to discard these impurities. We have to keep ourselves separate from them and not any longer identify with these impurities. So sometimes it appears like when you're cleaning a room which is very dusty, you walk in, it looks quite dirty, dusty, but the air is somewhat clean, but the dust is everywhere. And then you start cleaning it. So the dust is on all the surfaces, but when you start cleaning it, the dust starts going up into the air, and you have to clean it many, many times before you get it all out if it's been left for a long time. And sometimes it might seem that actually the room's getting worse. Better stop cleaning. But no, you keep cleaning, and eventually all the dust will be gathered and it'll be gone, and then it will be clean. And then to keep it clean, we have to dust it every day. The longer we leave it, the more dust to clear up. So this is our situation in the material world. The process of chanting Hare Krishna will cleanse the heart of all the dust accumulated for years. Cheto Darpanam Arjunam Bhav Mahadevagni Nirvaparam Shriyakayara Vachandrika Vitarnam Vijavada Jivanam Anandam Vidivardhanam Pratiparam Purnamrita Swadnam Sarvatmasnapanam Param Vijayate Shri Krishna Sankirtanam. So this Sankirtan movement is a prime benediction for humanity at large, spreads the rays of the benediction moon, enables us to fully taste the nectar for which we're always anxious. It is a life of all transcendental knowledge. So through simply the chanting of Hare Krishna, we will achieve spiritual perfection. We will regain our original spiritual identity. In the process of chanting, some dust might come up in the air, but we just continue cleaning it. So while we're in the material world, even when we're cleansed, that dust, we have to continue cleaning. And that way it keeps it clean. Otherwise, we'll become forgetful yet again. And this is the thing that we can take lessons from other devotees who have also been through the process and are further ahead than ourselves. So when we're having some difficulty in the practice, or trying to apply the practice, or in understanding what appears to be contradictions in the philosophy and the scriptures, then we can inquire from some other devotee who we may trust, or who we may think is more advanced than ourselves. And in this way we can clear our doubts, we can become free from the obstacles. So there was if as I remember the names, it was Yudhishthira Maharaj and Duryodhana, I think it was. They were asked to go out and find someone who was, Duryodhana was asked to go out and find someone who was more clever than he was, who was more intelligent than he was. And Yudhishthira Maharaj was asked to go out and find someone who was more fallen than he was. So this was the spiritual master's intention, was to show the difference between these two personalities. That Yudhishthira, he was so humble that he couldn't find anyone more fallen than himself. And Duryodhana, he couldn't find anyone more intelligent than himself. So this is the two opposites here, is pride and humility. And we see this. These two personalities were leaders of the opposing sides in the Battle of Kurukshetra, and we see the difference in consciousness was completely diametrically opposed. And of course, the whole Battle of Kurukshetra is a very complicated thing, and the whole Mahabharata explains that, and the Gita is simply the battle itself, or the conversation leading up prior to the battle, where Arjuna gains his courage and fights for the right cause. So we can choose to be like that. when we're having some difficulty, we can become proud and think, well, I'm not going to speak to anybody, I'm not going to listen to anybody, because nobody is more important, nobody's more intelligent than me, or nobody understands that I've got all my reasons sorted out of why I am the way I am. So one can be like that and remain in their stuck position, or one can be like Yudhishthira Maharaj, where he feels like everybody has got something that he can learn from. And this is the nature of the humble devotee, that he can learn from anyone. And so learning means that we actually make changes. We adjust ourselves. And these adjustments are sometimes uncomfortable, inconvenient, challenging. But by making these adjustments to advance in Krishna consciousness, we save ourselves from so much future discomfort, inconvenience, such as repeated birth and death. Taking birth in the material world is a big inconvenience for the spirit soul. And simply because we hang on to our attachments, which are, there's not even any substance to them, what we're attached to. Like say, for example, you're attached to a house or a car, a job, family. Then what about the previous possessions we had in the previous life? We don't care for them now. What about the body we had in our previous life? If we're attached to our own body now, our reputation, who were we in the previous life? We don't know. It could have been somebody very well known, and we're glorifying them, thinking, oh, this was such a great personality. It could have been some fool. It could have been some ignominious person. So everything in the material world is simply like a mirage. It has no real substance to it. It exists in the sense that it's a real experience. It's not that it's a dream, but it's dream-like in the sense it's a reality, but it's a temporary reality. So, as living spirit souls, eternal spirit souls, then the reality which we hanker is something which is unchanging, and that's why we become attached, because we want to make some permanent situation in the world. But we cannot, we have no choice in the matter. We cannot make a permanent situation in this world. No matter how much we try to safeguard ourselves, no matter how nice we are, how powerful we are, how rich, how popular, it doesn't matter. We cannot remain in this situation permanently. So the only permanent situation for the spirit soul is in the spiritual atmosphere. And our way to get back to that spiritual atmosphere is to take association of that spiritual atmosphere now, which means hearing, chanting, following directions of the Guru, Sadhu and Shastras, so that we can extricate from this material world and enter into the spiritual world. So we'll just stop there if anyone's got any questions or comments. Does anyone online get anything? Anybody online?
Yes.
Who?
There's three. I think there's three people watching. Mary Smith.
Who's there?
Mary Smith and three people.
Okay, thanks for joining online, Mary and...
It doesn't say the other three.
It doesn't say. Whoever else is there. Thanks for listening to our class. I hope I didn't offend anybody. But there's anything I've said, as far as I remember, I've just read in Srila Prabhupada's books.
Laura's got a question.
Yes, Laura?
Hare Krishna. How can we always remember Krishna's pastimes in the material world? Well, how can we always remember Krishna's pastimes in the material world?
A very good question. A couple of... What's that?
To help us be in the material world.
To help us what?
So it's a 2-point question. Hare Krishna, how can we always remember Krishna's pastimes in the material world to help us be in the material world?
To help us be in the material world. Okay, so I think if I understand the question correctly, so how can we remember Krishna's pastimes? That's the first part of it. To help us be in the material world. So you mean to be Krishna conscious in the material world? I think you've answered your own question. That if we remember Krishna's pastimes, we will be Krishna conscious even in the material world. So Srila Prabhupada says that repetition is the mother of learning. So by regularly hearing Srimad Bhagavatam, which is Krishna's pastimes, 10th canto, Krishna book, Chaitanya Charitamrita, Lord Chaitanya's pastimes, Srila Prabhupada's pastimes are non-different because they're also transcendental. It says that the devotee's pastimes and devotee's name is as good as chanting the Lord's name and hearing the Lord's pastimes. So by regular hearing, that verse is there in the Bhagavatam, regular hearing of Srimad Bhagavatam, all that is inauspicious within the heart is gradually destroyed to nil, and transcendental loving devotional service to the Supreme Lord is established in the heart as an irrevocable fact. So in other words, if we just keep on putting Krishna consciousness into our life, then it will come to the point where our mind, which we programmed with so many inauspicious things, will be overtaken by the auspicious Krishna consciousness. And instead of the mind coming up with things which is going to potentially cause us problem, in this way it's acting in the capacity of an enemy, then the mind becomes a friend instead. So the more Krishna consciousness we put in, then in due course of time, the more the mind will start to suggest Krishna conscious things. Now, we also have to consider being practical. So it's not that while we're doing something, we should be thinking, oh, I can't clean this floor in the temple, or I can't cook prasadam because I keep on burning it because I'm trying to remember Krishna's pastimes with Mother Yashoda and the cowherd boys, and while I'm remembering the pastimes, I'm forgetting that the cooker's left on. So we have to be practical. Our intention for cooking, for example, is to offer it to Krishna. So being attentive to doing the thing as nice as possible. It means that we don't have to be thinking of Krishna's pastimes at that point. You're actually taking part in Krishna's pastimes because you're cooking something for Krishna. Now we might not think, well, we might think that perhaps Krishna doesn't accept my offerings because I'm so fallen, who am I? But Krishna wants us to do that, and he accepts it. And when we're chanting, we don't have to be thinking of Krishna's pastimes artificially. We just hear and chant, and in due course of time, when the heart is completely pure, the pastimes will come automatically. So sadhana bhakti means the regular practice, which will then lead to the more spontaneous practice. And that will come of its own accord in due course of time. So while in the engaging in the process of sadhana bhakti or regulated devotional service, I probably say this is as if mechanical. Now it's not a mechanical process, but sometimes we have to regiment ourselves. We have to regulate ourselves. So that regardless of what the mind thinks, what the mind wants to do, the traits of the mind are thinking, feeling and willing. We may be feeling like this, we maybe want to do that, but we think, well, but we say to ourselves, no, my dear mind, we're going to sit down and chant Hare Krishna for the next 2 hours, or we're going to do puja, or we're going to read Bhagavatam or Krishna book or whatever. And we don't listen to what the mind says, and even if the mind's screaming, we just do it, and in this way we're actually transcending the mind. Even if the mind seems very loud, when Prabhupada says that when the devotional service begins, when things are difficult, so we don't have to look for difficulties because they come of their own accord. But when we're finding it difficult to maintain Krishna consciousness and we still push on, that's when we make more advancement. It's easy to do it when it's easy, isn't it? But when it's difficult, that requires some devotion. So therefore the regulation is there. And in due course of time, when we've undergone so many difficulties and still maintained our Krishna consciousness, then in due course there'll be no more inauspicious things to stand in the way, no more obstacles. So regular hearing and chanting and trying to keep association of devotees and keeping inauspicious things out of our lifestyle and accepting the auspicious Krishna conscious lifestyle, then this is a sure way of advancing in Krishna consciousness steadily, and then sometime you look back and think, well, I never thought I'd be able to give that up, but I did. And this is the power of Krishna consciousness. The potency is there. Because Krishna is pavitram, he's pure. So when we associate with Krishna through hearing of his pastimes, through chanting the name, through service, through discussing Krishna conscious philosophy, sharing it with others, then we are associating with Krishna, and in this way we become purified day by day. So it's incremental. Because we've been in the material world for a long, long time, then we have a lot of conditioning there. But Krishna consciousness is so powerful that it doesn't take many, many, many births. It's not that we'll have to take millions of births of Krishna consciousness to counteract millions of births in the material world. It can actually be in this one birth. Because when the sun comes up, it doesn't matter how long one has been in the darkness. As soon as the sun comes, then everything is illuminated. Everything's illumined. So when the sun of Krishna consciousness appears, and this is the holy name, then the darkness is starting to dissipate. So at the moment we're in the dawning of our Krishna consciousness, and perhaps we're not fully enlightened as yet, but we just keep on going with it, and in due course of time, just as day follows night, then this practice of Krishna consciousness will illumine our eternal connection with Krishna. We don't have to worry about that. Prabhupada's given us everything which is necessary for us to remember Krishna and go back to Godhead. Is that okay? Anything else?
Yeah, Laura says, thank you very much for your answer. It helps a lot. Sometimes it's not until one starts to control the mind we realise how uncontrollable the mind is.
That's a good point, yeah. The mind is controllable, and it can be our friend. It's only also when we try to control the mind do we realise how out of control it's been. Basically, we've been led by our mind and senses, since day one. This is the situation when the baby appears. Its way of acquiring knowledge is called anamaya, which means, anamaya means that our knowledge is acquired through the mouth, through feeding, through eating. And you see a child, everything goes in the mouth. Even and the parents always have to watch it doesn't swallow that and choke. And then different ways of acquiring knowledge, and ultimately Anandamaya, the living entity, is looking for bliss. We realise there is no bliss in this material world. We're looking in so many ways for happiness and bliss, and we're not finding it. We're not finding anything substantial or permanent. And when we take to Krishna consciousness, we realise this is where it's at. So we get a little taste. So in times where we have some crisis of faith or struggling with the mind and senses, then personally I've found it's good to look back and remember the times when you actually got a taste, like you had a nice kirtan or an amazing feast or some association of some elevated soul, something like that, to just remind yourself that it's real, because the mind can fog over our intelligence at times. So the more we put Krishna consciousness into our life, then the more the ignorance and attachment to the material world will vanish. It's our nature, Prabhupada said, to be attached, so we just have to transfer that attachment to Krishna. We don't have to become detached from the material world. Material world detachment comes as a result of being attached to Krishna. And then that detachment is such that we only see things in the material world in relation to Krishna, so if it's usable in Krishna's service, we accept it. If it's not, then we have no interest. So this is a transformation, and this is the path that we're on by the message of Srila Prabhupada. Okay, Grantaraj Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita ki, Iskon Gurvinda ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu ki. Thank you for your questions. Hare Krishna. Wasn't anything else, was there?